Chapter 22. They swarmed up towards Sherbird's house, a-whooping and a-raging like Injuns, and everything had to clear the way or get run over and tromped to mush, and it was awful to see. Children was a-heeling it ahead of the mob, screaming and trying to get out of the way, and every window along the road was full of women's heads, and there was boys in every tree, and bucks and wenches looking over every fence, and as soon as the mob would get nearly to them, they would break and skedaddle back out of their reach. Lots of the women and girls was crying and taking on, scared most to death. They swarmed up in front of Sherburne's palings as thick as they could jam together, and you couldn't hear yourself think for the noise. It was a little 20-foot yard. Some sung out, "Tear down the fence! Tear down the fence!" And then there was a racket of ripping and tearing and smashing. And down she goes, and the front wall of the crowd begins to roll in like a wave. Just then, Sherburne steps out onto the roof of his little front porch with a double-barrel gun in his hand, and he takes his stand, perfectly calm, deliberate, not saying a word. The racket stopped, and the waves sucked back. Sherburne never said a word, just stood there, looking down. The stillness was awful creepy and uncomfortable. Sherburne run his eyes slow along the crowd, and wherever it struck, the people tried to outgaze him, but they couldn't. They dropped their eyes and looked sneaky, and then pretty soon Sherburne sort of laughed. Not the pleasant kind, but the kind that makes you feel like you feel when you're eating bread that's got sand in it. And then he says, slow and scornful, "The idea of you lynching anybody. It's amusing. The idea of you thinking you had pluck enough to lynch a man. Because you're brave enough to tar and feather poor friendless cast-out women who come along here. Did that make you think you had grit enough to lay your hands on a man? Why, a man is safe in the hands of 10,000 of your kind, as long as it's daytime and you're not behind him. Do I know you? I know you clear enough. I was born and raised in the South. I've lived in the North, so I know the average all around. The average man's a coward. In the North, he lets anybody walk over him that wants to, and goes home, prays for a humble spirit to bear it. In the South, one man all by himself has stopped a stage full of men in the daytime and robbed the lot. Your newspapers call you brave people, so much that you think you are braver than other people, whereas you're just as brave and no braver, which is to say not brave at all. Why don't your juries hang murderers? 'Cause they're afraid that the man's friends will shoot him in the back, in the dark. And it's just what they would do. So they always acquit. And then a man goes and does it in the night, with 100 masked cowards at his back, and lynches the rascal. Your mistake is that you didn't bring a man with you. That's one mistake. And the other is that you didn't come in the dark and fetch your masks. You brought part of a man here, Buck Harkness there. And if you hadn't had him to start you, you'd have taken it out and blowing. You didn't want to come. The average man don't like trouble and danger. You don't like trouble and danger. But if you're only a half a man like Buck Harkness there, shouts, "Lynch him! Lynch him!" You're afraid to back down. You're afraid you'll be found out to what you are. Cowards. And so you raise a yell and you hang yourselves onto that half a man's coattail and come a-raging up here, swearing what big things you're going to do. Pitifulest thing out there is a mob. And that's what an army is. A mob. They don't fight with courage that's born in them, but with courage that's borrowed from their mass, from their officers. But a mob without any man at the head of them is beneath pitifulness. Now the thing for you to do is to droop your tails and go on and crawl home in a hole. If there's any lynching that's going to be done, it'll be done in the dark, Southern fashion. And when they come, they'll bring their masks and fetch a man along. Now leave and take your half a man with you. And then he tosses up his gun across his left arm and cocking it when he says this. Well, the crowd, they washed back sudden and then broke all apart and went tearing off in every which way. And Buck Harkness, he heeled after them, looking tolerable cheap. I could have stayed if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. I went to the circus and loafed around the backside till the watchman went by, and then dived in under the tent. I had my $20 gold piece and some other money, but I reckon I'd better save it, 'cause there ain't no telling how soon you're going to need it, away from home and amongst strangers that way. You can't be too careful. I ain't opposed to spending money on circuses when there ain't no other way, but there ain't no use in wasting it on 'em. It was a real bully circus. It was the splendidest sight that ever was when they all came a-riding in, 2 by 2, and gentlemen and ladies, side by side, and the men just in their drawers and undershirts and no shoes or stirrups, and resting their hands on their thighs easy and comfortable. But there must have been 20 of them, and every lady with a lovely complexion and perfectly beautiful, and looking just like a gang of real sure queens, and dressed in clothes that cost millions of dollars, just littered with diamonds. It was a powerful fine sight. I never seen such a thing so lovely. And then, one by one, they got up and stood and went a-weaving around the ring, so gentle and wavy and graceful, and the men looking ever so tall and airy and straight, with their heads bobbing and skimming along away up under the tent roof, and every lady's rose-leafy dress flapping along soft and silky around her hips, and she looking just like the most lovely parasol ever. And they went faster and faster, all of 'em dancing, first one foot in the air and then the other, the horses leaning more and more, and the ringmaster going round and round the center pole, cracking his whip and shouting, "Hi! Hi!" and the clown cracking jokes behind him. And by all hands dropped the reins, and every lady put her knuckles on her hips, and every gentleman folded his arms. And then how the horses did lean over, and on they did hump themselves, and so one after another they all skipped off into the ring, made the sweetest bow I ever see. And then they scampered out, and everybody clapped their hands and went just about wild. But all through the circus they'd done the most astonishing things, and all the time that clown carried on so, it most killed the people. The ringmaster couldn't say a word to him, but he was back at him as quick as a wink, the funniest things a body ever did say. And how he could ever think of so many of them, and so sudden, and so pat. Well, that was a way I couldn't understand, nohow. Well, I couldn't have thought of them in a year. And by a drunken man tried to get into the ring, said he wanted to ride. And he could ride as well as anybody that ever was. And they argued and tried to keep him out, but he wouldn't listen. And the whole show come to a standstill. And then the people begun to holler at him and make fun of him. And that made him mad. So he began to rip and tear, and so that stirred up the people. And a lot of men began to pile down off the benches and swarm in toward the ring saying, "Knock him down! Throw him out!" And 1 or 2 women begun to scream. So then the ringmaster, he made a little speech. And he said that he hoped there wouldn't be no disturbance. And if that man would promise he wouldn't make no more trouble, well, he would let him ride, if he thought he could stay on the horse. So everybody laughed and said, "Well, all right." And the man, he got on. And the minute he was on, the horse began to rip and tear and jump and cavort around, with 2 circus men hanging onto his bridle, trying to hold him, the drunk man hanging onto his neck, his heels flying in the air with their jump, and the whole crowd of people standing up and shouting and laughing till tears rolled down. And at last, sure enough, all the circus men could do, well, the horse broke loose, and away he went around the very nation, round and round the ring, with that sot laying down on him and hanging onto his neck, with first one leg hanging mostly to the ground, then the other again. The people was just crazy. It weren't funny to me, though. I was all tremble to see his danger. But pretty soon, he struggled up a straddle, grabbed the bridle, reeling still this way and that. The next minute, he sprung up and dropped the bridle and stood. And the horse a-going just like a house afire, too. And he just stood there, a-sailing around as easy and comfortable as if he weren't ever drunk in his life. And then he began to pull off his clothes and sling them. And he shed them so thick they kind of clogged up the air. Altogether, he shed 17 suits. And then there he was, slim and handsome, and dressed the gaudiest and prettiest you ever saw. And he lit into that horse with his whip and made him fairly hum. And finally skipped off and made his bow and danced off to the dressing room, and everybody just a-howling with the pleasure and the astonishment. And then the ringmaster, he see how he'd been fooled. He was the sickest ringmaster you ever saw, I reckon. Why, it'd been one of his own men. He'd got up that joke all out of his own head and never let on to nobody. Well, I felt sheepish to be took in so, but I wouldn't have been in that ringmaster's place, not for $1,000. I don't know. There might be bullier circuses than that one was, but I never struck them yet. Anyways, it was a good enough show for me, and whenever I run across it, it can have all of my custom every time. Well, that night we had our show, but there weren't only about 12 people there, just enough to pay expenses, and they laughed all the time, and that made the Duke mad, and everybody left anyway, before the show was over, but one boy who was asleep. And the Duke said these Arkansas lunkheads couldn't have come up Shakespeare. What they wanted was low comedy, and maybe something rather worse than low comedy, he reckoned. He said he could size their style. So next morning he got some big sheets of wrapping paper and some black paint and drawed off some handbills and stuck them up all over the village. And the bills said, "At the courthouse, 3 nights only, the world-renowned traditions, Derek the Garrick the Younger and Edmund Kean the Elder of London and Continental theaters, and their thrilling and tragedy, The King's Camel-Leopard, or The Royal Nonsuch. Admission, 50 cents. And then at the bottom was the biggest line of all, which said, "Ladies and children not admitted." There, he says. If that line don't fetch him, I don't know Arkansas.